Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we'll talk about microservices. We'll talk about what is important about them, what's different about them, and as usual, we'll be joined by Mike Amundsen. Hey Mike, how are you doing?
Hey, how you doing? Good to see you.
Doing well, thanks. And this is our first official episode of our What Would the Web Do series, where we look at different technologies, patterns, and we discuss how they compare in terms of enterprise IT and web architecture. So Mike, how did you get started with microservices? When did you first encounter them, and what did you think when you heard about them?
Well, you were asking this before then. I was trying to figure out when do I mark sort of my first microservice experience? And I'm not really sure. I think it was about 10 years ago or so. It was right about the time that I started in the API Academy, like a couple of years before that maybe. And it was really this notion of having to write really agile code. I was working in a CMS system, a content management system that was very customized for individual customers. We're trying to figure out how we can release updates safely over and over and over again, because we're a really small group. So we started breaking the project that we had, which I guess you would have called a monolith back then, right, into smaller and smaller pieces. And it was really out of desperation. I actually thought it was a kind of a sign of failure. I couldn't get this thing to work, but I knew if I could get smaller parts working, then we would get away with it. In other words, I was like, okay, well, we'll just do these in separate parts instead. So I think my first experience was really just sort of, hadn't read about them. I didn't really know what they were called. It was me just trying to solve a release and agility problem that I have inside my little software project.
So in the end, I think you encountered them by just doing them. And at some point you realized that, hey, there's a label for them.
Hey, this is a thing. This is a thing. How about you?
Yeah, so for me, it was different. I actually first really heard about them or started looking at them when I joined API Academy, when we started working together, because you had just released that book on Microservices Architecture.
That's right.
And I was curious about them, and we did a lot of presentations around them. So that was my first exposure. And I do remember when I read through the book and tried to get started with microservices, to me, it seemed like, yeah, sure, this is why would you do it any other way? That was, I think, my first impression. It's like, sure, like self-contained code units that are relatively dedicated, and then you build those, and then when you build something else, you build it somewhere else in a different way so that you can minimize dependencies. It just seemed to me like, yeah, that is how you would build something that should scale. But I learned then,
go ahead.
That a lot of things in enterprise IT are not necessarily the way that you think they should be. There's a lot of history and kind of traditional ideas around them.
Yeah, well, that I was going to say, that seems logical, but at the time, I had experience with some other enterprise software. What I was working on was very sort of webby, kind of online, sort of workflow-ish content management system. But I had a lot of experience with enterprise IT before that, and we had been doing this thing called, service-oriented architecture, which kind of had the same notion of where everybody gets to sort of release their small things, and we had these WSDL documents that we shared, and it did not work at all. I mean, it didn't scale well for us. It was complex. Things broke a lot. So when I was faced with similar kinds of problems, I was really worried. I thought, this is going to end up like before. Now, it didn't. We used a lot of sort of webbishness about the things. We weren't using WSDL documents, and we weren't even using XML anymore. We used it for a little while, but it was really, I have to say, it wasn't sort of this revelation that this is going to be a great idea. It was literally oh my gosh, let's just try this and see if we can get released on time. It was really sort of a whatever would work kind of experience for me. And in the end, I realized, oh, I think I'm doing something that other people talked about. But it was only later. I was too deep in the work to figure it out, I think.
It's funny that you mentioned SOA. I do, and I still actually do that. So whenever I talk about microservices, one of the things I say, and it's a little bit controversial, I guess, that I say it's SOA done right. And that is still my take on it, saying, SOA actually is a good idea, services, that I think that's what we want to do. But my opinion was always that SOA kind of failed or wasn't quite as successful as people were hoping for, because SOA never really looked at kind of how do you manage and implement those services. It just said, have a lot of services, right? And I think then what happened also, a lot of the vendors, the large enterprise vendors, right, basically jumped onto that and say, look, you don't have to change anything. All you have to do is press the little generate whistle button and you're doing SOA. And I think that is what killed SOA, because that meant very little. And people realized that it adds a little bit of value, but it still doesn't mean that we can change things easily, that we can add things easily, right? It opens up some things. So that's a plus, but we still are inflexible and slow. And I think these issues of inflexibility and speed, right? This is what microservices then really were tackling in a much better way, which is why I like this idea of saying it's SOA, but done right. But I know that a lot of people don't like it when I say that.
I guess not. I mean, several things come to mind. That first interview with Werner Vogels that ACM did back more than 10 years ago, they were asking him about how he was breaking things up and what are you doing and what do you call it? And I think he said, well, you call it service-oriented architecture, right? I mean, he still had the same name, from 10, 15 years ago. So there's that sort of SOA done right story. And the other one is exactly what I experienced, pretty much what you were saying, which was when I first did that sort of enterprise-y SOA, I didn't really change much. I just sort of broke the classes into modules, and then we published the WSDL, and that was it. But it was hard to scale. It was brittle to manage. When I ended up having to solve my CMS problem, we were already doing everything on the web. We didn't really think of it as a software as a service back then, but that's really what it was. And immediately, one of the first things I did is I started using caching, right? I started making speed a more important factor. So I borrowed that idea from the web. I used what the web did. So when I built my services and we passed data around, we already started using things from the web, and that sort of made things really change. And I think when you look at Chris Richardson's microservice patterns book and a lot of the things, the whole, building microservices from Sam Newman, you start to see what's different about what I was experiencing back in my SOA experience was we're actually using parts of the web, things like these patterns, these independent services, these caching services, all these other things. So I think that's the done right part, right? I think we learn from some other channels, hey, we have to do speed and we have to do scale. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think there's different pieces coming together. So the done right part, I think in part it's microservices, right? It's really this idea of making sure that whatever you do in a self-contained way, and you try to make things kind of only as big as you have to make them, and try to keep them small. The other thing that I think we will probably tackle in a different episode, right, is this idea of, yes, SOAP also had some just fundamental problems around how it looked at how to expose services. But in my mind, I always thought that even though I don't like the way how SOAP works, because it's that tunnel style RPC kind of metaphor that really doesn't work so well, but I think that was not the biggest problem with the soapy SOA time. I think the biggest problem was really that the underlying implementations just were the same than they were before. And if you wanted to change things and people said, hey, that service is nice, but I need it a little different, or can you give it to me in a different way, or whatever, right? Like people said, yeah, 2 years from now, maybe. It was really hard, right? And I think that is what microservices were very much focused on, saying that you build these things as quickly as you can, you expose them to consumers, you can easily deal with feedback, you can improve them. And that seemed to me much more like the feedback loop of getting in front of consumers and making sure you build something that consumers like. That is much more kind of also in the spirit of the web, and not just building something and just throw it out and say, it's like, whoever likes it, just take it, just don't bother me anymore.
I think there were other sort of fundamental things for me. I didn't really understand about context boundaries, where things start and where things stop, what goes in the thing. And I learned that from microservices, right? I learned that through domain-driven design, that it's applied to microservices. So that was a mistake I was making quite frequently in the beginning. I didn't really understand where to draw the lines. I think the other one is sort of what you mentioned, and that is the WSDL, the description language that we used was super tightly bound. Even the tooling, every time I was using Microsoft tooling at the time, I think everybody did this, but that's what I was using. Every time I would recompile, I would get a new version number on my WSDL interface. That's just a tooling thing. That has nothing to do with SOAP. That has nothing to do with SOA. It's just a tool I was using. So every time I would rebuild something, even if I was fixing a bug, I'd get a different version number and I could break something. So I think there were just a lot of things that I didn't understand at the time. And tools didn't really help me out very much at the time. So I think there are a lot of similarities, but I think the differences are being so much smarter about the context boundaries, so much smarter about the tooling. Actually, like you were just saying, this whole idea of, rather than a big upfront kind of centralized management experience, build something small, minimum viable product, see if people like it. So I think they're just a combination of a bunch of things that make the microservice paradigm much more successful and much more sustainable. It's been at it for like 15 years.
And another thing you just mentioned, I also like that a lot, and that's probably another episode for us, is this idea that in SOAP and in WSDL, you were still very much kind of inspired by this RPC idea of, I try to make distributed computing, look like local computing, right? I use procedure calls, which are going to a remote machine, but people actually don't have to worry about that because there's machinery in between. And I think that's another fundamental leap that we're doing now, that more and more we understand that distributed computing and even more so decentralized computing is very different from writing a localized program under like one authority. And I think that's something that SOAP desperately try to hide. And I think you always, the more you stretch that, right? So the bigger the scope gets, the more you realize that maybe trying to hide that is really not that sustainable. And I think we get more and more to the phase where people realize that distribution and decentralization is just a fact of how you build systems nowadays. And I think that is also where microservices were very important, right? To get us to this point where, everybody builds their own thing, and they only consume other stuff through APIs, and they expose whatever they do through APIs. And that becomes a different thing than writing a program. That is something that I like a lot. In that article that talked about the consequences of the Bezos mandate, the API mandate. I think there was a lot of mentioning around like how that makes things more complicated, because now you have to do like finding root causes, monitoring, being able to figure out where a problem actually originates, right? All of this becomes much harder in that kind of distributed context, but that's kind of the price you have to pay if you want that flexibility and speed of change that they were going for. And they very explicitly said, right, it cost us years to make this work, but it was still worth it.
I think that's exactly right. I think you're referring to Werner Vogel's second article, right? When he talked about sort of the history of S3 and how difficult it was and stuff like that, right? So I think was there
Steve
another one?
Thing, actually.
Oh, the Yegi memo, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Which goes back even further to sort of the original Bezos mandate. That's exactly become kind of the meme about like everybody will talk through APIs, and if you don't like it, you're fired, the kind of story. Like people like that story. Yeah, I think one of the things that I experienced was this what you were just talking about, centralization, decentralization, and distribution. That I hoped that at one point I hoped that the network would be invisible, like I wouldn't have to be network aware, that I would just have a procedure call and that would be it. But as you said, as things expanded bigger and bigger, I needed to be network aware. I needed to know if this was going to be a distant call or a non-distant call. If that had to do with my use of caching and all these other things. So I think that's one of the complications that we have to pay for, and that is you need to know if you're network aware. And I think web APIs, the phrase web API, has made it cool to be network aware. Like you don't have to hide the network. I need to know a little bit about HTTP. I need to have some library that does transportation. Or even MQTT, even if I'm doing, message-based, event-driven architecture. So I think that was a big change that I experienced. I thought having to know about the network back when I was doing this 15 years ago was kind of like a bummer. It was kind of a failure, that it was supposed to be magically, hidden. But it turns out that was actually the thing that helped us actually get it done and do that speed at scale that you were just talking about earlier, is being network aware. So I think that's a big change for microservices. Microservices are usually aware of their surroundings, and that's why we have sidecars and proxies and all these other things along the way. That's part of the additional complication of microservices, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, at least, that part was kind of easy to ease into, because when I entered kind of the enterprise computing space, I came from distributed systems and all of this. So for me, it was kind of natural that distribution is something to think about. It's not something that you can just ignore with some, magic tooling, and then you can just treat everything as one large computer. And I think that there was a time when this was kind of that was almost like the SOAP time, right? Where basically anything is a remote procedure call and it'll just work. And then people realized that, no, it doesn't just work. The failure modes become more complicated, right? Like how do you recover from those and all of these kind of things. So I think I think we still have a little ways to go. I think developers still sometimes think not enough about these kind of complications of distributed computing. But I think we're getting closer and closer, because we do get more and more systems that are very complex and are highly distributed and have complex failure modes. So I think we're definitely going more and more into the direction of everybody being aware of that and managing it responsibly.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing, and this is another episode we could talk about. Another thing, along with becoming network aware, you mentioned earlier that you sort of have to, it's harder to chase down a problem. It's harder to actually trace a request through the system. So this whole move to observability and monitoring and all these other things, not just at performance level, but just sort of understanding how the system is operating, is going to also help an awful lot. Developers sort of have to come down on the side of figuring out what their network aware level is. And then I think the next thing is going to be, they're going to have to be system aware. Yeah, I'm only part of a system. I'm part of a lot of other traffic. I need to carry, transaction IDs or other things around so that other people can participate. So I think there's another level that we still have to go in terms of creating an efficient and possibly optimized network, and that has a lot to do with observability. And there's a big trend in observability right now, which I think is a real positive.
Yeah, I like that idea that you probably have to learn more about how to be a kind of a nice player in that bigger space of where people are using microservices, and there's certain patterns of how you can make that harder or easier. And I think that is something where microservices definitely give us a good start, I think, to do something that works well.
I think that's right. Yeah. So there you go.
Okay. So I think we can wrap it up. I really like the way this went. So this was our first attempt at talking about what would the web do. So we took one topic that was kind of an obvious one, I think, microservices.
Good start, yeah.
And I think for that one, we can say that we do see a lot of inspiration or even adoption, so to speak, in the enterprise space already. And I'm wondering how that will turn out for other topics we will discuss. It might be a little different, I'm suspecting. But
I suspect as well. I think you're right.
Okay.
What are we have to figure out what we're gonna talk about next, right?
Do we have to figure that out now?
No.
Good.
Absolutely not.
We already have a whole list, right? So
we got a nice list.
We won't disclose that. That list is a tightly guarded secret. And I think we added 2 more items at least today.
I think
I'm suspecting this list will probably just keep growing. We'll never get to an end of this.
It'll get ahead of us.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so thanks a lot for joining. I hope everybody found that interesting. If you have any comments, please let us know. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And stay tuned for our next episode of What Would the Web Do, which will be about something different. We'll figure it out.
Different. We'll decide later. All right,
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody. Take it easy. Bye-bye.